This photo was taken at the Arab League Summit in 2010. For decades, these six friends ruled over their countries with an iron fist, enjoying untapped power, influence, and riches. What they didn't know was that over the next 10 years, all of them would be overthrown by their own people. So how did they rise to power, and how did they fall? Let's start with Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali. Bin Ali's rise to power was swift. He was raised in a middle-class family in the Tunisian port city of Sousse, where he joined the resistance movement against French colonialists, and later enlisted in the army, working his way up to become the country's chief of military intelligence. In 1987, he was appointed prime minister by Tunisia's anti-colonial icon Habib Bourguiba, whose health and popularity was in steep decline. Just 1 month later, Ben Ali removed Bourguiba from power and declared himself Tunisia's president. As leader, Ben Ali enacted sweeping reforms, promising a new era for Tunisia after years of repression. But these didn't last long, and soon his party dominated parliament and he was running unopposed. Critics were jailed and journalists pressured to stay in line. By 2010, Tunisia was one of the world's most repressive regimes. Meanwhile, punitive economic restrictions on the country's working class pushed many to the brink of desperation. On the 17th of December 2010, a young street vendor by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire outside a government house after his license was suspended, lighting a fuse that ignited a historic wave of protests across the country and the region. On the 14th of January 2011, Ben Ali conceded power and fled with his family to Saudi Arabia, where he evaded trial for corruption and the brutal crackdown on protesters until his death in 2019 from prostate cancer. He had led Tunisia for 23 years. Hosni Mubarak was also a military man, born to humble rural means. He rose to prominence as an Air Force pilot who became a war hero following the Yom Kippur War with Israel in 1973. 2 years later, he was appointed vice president by Anwar Sadat. In 1981, during a military parade commemorating the war, Sadat was assassinated by armed gunmen, and Mubarak suddenly found himself president. He promised Egyptians economic prosperity, but that never materialized. Instead, he and his family were accused of amassing billions in wealth with the help of real estate tycoons, while his security apparatus ran Egypt's daily affairs with impunity, turning the country into a police state. Following the brutal death of a young man named Khalid Said at the hands of police in 2010, a small anti-government swell began to grow against him. When Ben Ali was successfully overthrown in Tunisia, Egyptians were inspired to do the same. On the 25th of January 2011, protesters began occupying Cairo's Tahrir Square. 18 days later, after hundreds of protesters were gunned down and millions more filled the streets, Mubarak was forced to step down by the country's military. Mubarak, his sons and associates were tried and sentenced to decades in prison for corruption, fraud and the killing of protesters. However, as Egypt's military slowly regained power in the following years, many of those sentenced were overturned, and Mubarak died a peaceful death in 2020, a free man. He was president of Egypt for 30 years. Most people remember Muammar al-Gaddafi for his crazy antics and extravagant style, but Gaddafi was once a revolutionary icon. At just 27 years old, he overthrew Libya's unpopular King Idris I in 1969, with the help of a group of military officers called the Free Officers Movement. Gaddafi declared Libya a republic and nationalized the country's recently discovered oil reserves, lifting Libya's economy out of poverty and improving the standard of living for Libyans. In 1973, he declared a popular revolution to implement a new vision for Libya, his vision, under what he dubbed the Third Universal Theory, rejecting the US and Soviet Union as imperialist powers in favor of a pan-Arab, pan-Islamic socialism. Gaddafi published his philosophy in a series of volumes later known as the Green Book, implementing them in school curriculums and using them to base his country's political and legal system on. His anti-Western narrative soured his relationship with the US, which embargoed Libyan oil in 1982. That was followed by a series of sanctions by the UN, following accusations Gaddafi was behind a series of terror attacks. The sanctions crippled Libya's economy and encouraged Gaddafi to exert more control over the country, purging institutions from critics and cracking down on tribal leaders and opposition figures. When Libyans began to protest in 2011, Gaddafi responded defiantly, vowing to shut down and kill those he accused of undermining the country.
لكن أنا ما عنديش منصب، ما عنديش حاجة أستقيل منها، عندي بندقيتي، أنا هنقاتل لآخر قطرة من دمي، ومعي الشعب الليبي.
Thus began the start of the Libyan civil war, pushing many protesters to take up arms in the face of Gaddafi's military. Many officials and officers also defected and set up the National Transitional Council in the eastern provinces of the country. The UN Security Council also stepped in, imposing a no-fly zone to ground Gaddafi's air force and stop him bombing his own cities. On the 20th of October 2011, a NATO airstrike destroyed a military convoy carrying Gaddafi. He was detained by a local militia and was found dead a few hours later. He had ruled Libya for 42 years. Like Gaddafi, Yemen's Ali Abdullah Saleh was not going down without a fight. He had ruled over one of the region's poorest and most divided countries, starting out as a soldier fighting in the North Yemen Civil War in the 60s and 70s that overthrew the Saudi-backed monarch with the help of Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. Saleh eventually became North Yemen's president, and by 1990 was negotiating the unification of Yemen and a place for himself as its first leader. Over the following years, he would crush uprisings from his southern opponents, as well as from the Houthi rebels in the north. Yemen's economy never recovered from decades of war, but Saleh and his family amassed a private fortune of up to $60 billion. When an uprising began on the 27th of January 2011, Saleh quickly vowed not to seek re-election, but refused to step down as president, even after an assassination attempt in June left him physically scarred. He eventually ceded power to his deputy and disappeared from public light, but he still wasn't done. In 2014, he allied with his former enemies in the north, the Houthis, and helped them take over the capital Sana'a. A regional military coalition led by Saudi Arabia responded, backing Yemen's government. This ignited a devastating civil war, killing tens of thousands and plunging the country into the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
This is not a natural disaster. It is man-made.
In late 2017, the Houthis discovered Saleh was in talks with Saudi and the UAE to end the war and reinstate him as Yemen's leader. Branded a traitor, Saleh was killed while trying to flee an ambush by Houthi fighters on the 4th of December. He had ruled North Yemen for 12 years and Yemen for 22. This could have been where the story ends. But in 2018, a new wave of popular uprisings would shake the region's power structure once again. Its first target was Sudan's longtime dictator, Omar al-Bashir. Like his counterpart in Egypt, Omar al-Bashir cut his teeth in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, serving as a paratrooper in the Egyptian army. He then spent years working his way up the ladder of the Sudanese army, serving in a number of foreign posts, and when he returned to Sudan as a colonel in 1989, he had big plans for himself. He led a military overthrow of Sudan's elected government and declared himself leader, dissolving all other parties and councils and imposing a strict Islamic code on the country. As president of Sudan, Bashir also inherited the decades-long civil war between the government and separatist factions, fought largely over ethnic and religious divisions between ruling Muslim Arabs in the north and non-Arab Africans in the south. The height of the war was in Darfur, where Bashir brutally cracked down on rebel groups, killing hundreds of thousands in what was described as a campaign of ethnic cleansing. In 2008 and 2012, Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and accused of orchestrating a genocide in Darfur. Bashir rejected the claims and refused to stand trial. The UN responded by imposing heavy sanctions on Sudan. When South Sudan eventually seceded in 2011, Sudan's economy plummeted, leading to skyrocketing inflation rates and unemployment. By 2018, subsidies for bread and electricity had been stripped, leaving large sections of the population angry and desperate. So when Bashir announced he would run for re-election, the Sudanese people erupted, filling public squares with months of protest. On the 11th of April 2019, the country's military stepped in and ousted Bashir, putting him on trial for corruption and money laundering. In February 2020, Sudan's transitional government agreed to hand Bashir over to the ICC to stand trial for war crimes in Darfur. This brings us to our final Arab leader, Algeria's Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Like Ben Ali, Bouteflika began his career fighting French colonialism. He joined the National Liberation Front and worked his way into several government positions following independence, as well as president of the UN General Assembly in 1974. Just a few years later, he fled the country after he was caught siphoning 60 million dinars into foreign accounts. He was convicted in absentia, but later pardoned and invited back. He repaid 12 million, but the rest remains unaccounted for. In 1992, Algeria's army orchestrated a coup against an elected conservative Islamic party, plunging the country into a decade of violent civil conflict. By 1999, Bouteflika re-emerged as a conciliatory figure that also had the military's blessings, and after an election marred by allegations of fraud, he was voted into power. As president, Bouteflika promised strong economic reforms and amnesty for those involved in the civil war. But a decade later, plummeting oil prices left the resource-rich government struggling to maintain subsidies. When protests began in 2011, Bouteflika pacified Algerians by promising jobs and social housing. This convinced some, while others feared a return to the violence of the 90s. But 2 years later, Bouteflika suffered a debilitating stroke that left him unable to appear in public. As time dragged on, Algerians were left wondering whether he was still running the country, and if he was even alive. So on the 10th of February 2019, when a statement announced he would seek re-election, Algerians had had enough. On the 2nd of April, Bouteflika resigned after 20 years in power and has continued to remain away from the public eye. 10 years ago, these 6 men stood side by side for the last time. They shaped their nations in their image only to end their careers disgraced and rejected. In Algeria, Sudan, Yemen, Libya, Egypt and Tunisia, their people continue to fight for a brighter future. But first, they must undo the legacies of repression and corruption that ruled over their worlds for decades.